Hey everyone, so today I'd like to introduce you to a bit of an oddity, and that is the Korean five-sided sword. So I found this sword on Martial Arts Swords, and they called it the Paedo, which literally translates to saber. It doesn't necessarily translate to a five-sided sword. So what is a five-sided sword? A five-sided sword is not a sword that has five edges, rather it's a sword where the cross-section is a pentagon. And there's a couple of ways to do this, and I'll go into that a bit later. Now, with Korean swords, there's not that much uniformity between them in terms of length, cross-sections, handle wrapping, handle types, etc. Unlike Japanese swords where everything was quite strictly uniform, the Korean swords didn't really have that uniformity. Now, cross-sections with Korean swords in more modern times typically fall into two categories. That is, the triangular cross-section and the hexagonal cross-section. Hexagonal cross-section being far more common, and that's also what you see on most katanas. So the hexagonal cross-section in Korean is called gojo, and it's akin to shinogi-zukuri in Japanese. And what that has, it has bulged shinogi, so it's got two flats and then a pointed primary bevel coming off that, so that you have a hexagon as your cross-section. And that gives it a little bit more strength. So you have a stronger blade. It's a little bit heavier compared to if it didn't have those flats, but it gives a little bit more stiffness to that blade so that you can thrust and stab with it. Problems with that is that it's a bit heavier and that you've got a widened cutting angle because you don't have as much slope for that primary bevel to go along to create a narrow cutting angle. Now, in contrast to that would be the Korean samgakdo, or the three-sided sword, which is the literal translation of samgakdo. And in Korean they call that cross-section pyungjo, and that's akin to the Japanese hira-zukuri. Now, hira-zukuri or pyungjo have a steep angle. They've got no shinogi, no flat. It's just a primary bevel and either a flat top or maybe a triangulated spine. And what this does is that it has a much lighter blade because you've lost all the material that you had from the shinogi and now it's all just blade. And so it makes it a lot lighter. It's also a lot sharper because you can have a narrower cutting edge. So you can cut through things much better. The problem with it is that it's not so great for stabbing because you don't have that stiffness in the blade. Then the blade can break when stabbing, or it can also get damaged and break when cutting harder targets. So now talking about the five-sided sword. So in Japan they do have an equivalent, and it's called katakiriha-zukuri, where one side is gojo or bulged, and that's shinogi-zukuri or kiriha-zukuri, which is basically shinogi-zukuri, but the shinogi line is more than half the thickness of the entire blade. And then the other side is pyungjo or hira-zukuri, where it's flat. And this can be done in two different ways. So you can have it with a angled pyungjo, so that you have like the hira-zukuri where the two lines come together and form the bevel, or you can have that with a vertical pyungjo where it's a flat line and then it's more like a chisel. And the chisel type is a little bit sharper, but it's got a thinner cutting edge, and therefore it has problems when hitting hard targets. Now, the benefits of the five-sided sword are that you have that little bit more thickness. So compared to the samgakdo, then it's a little bit stiffer. You can still thrust with it, and it does a little bit better against hard targets. But compared to the shinogi-zukuri or the gojo, then it's a little bit lighter, a little bit more maneuverable, and it's also just a little bit sharper compared to that. Now, some problems with the five-sided sword are that it's supposedly the best of both worlds, but it doesn't really excel in either area compared to a samgakdo or a normal shinogi-zukuri sword. And they're also extremely hard to forge. Because they have an asymmetrical cross-section, then in the water quenching, then there's more material on one side, so in that cooling, then it tends to bend, and so they're quite hard to make. And it's probably the reason why they got phased out. There's not that many examples of them, and it's probably because they were hard to make, and that mass-produced, then it was basically impossible to do. But, there's also no real evidence for that. That's just my speculation. And so having a look here at the Martial Arts Sword Paedo, then it's a quite typical Korean design. You can see that the gojo on this one is kiriha-zukuri because the shinogi line is more than 50% of the thickness of the blade. The other thing about it is that there's no yokote line, where there's a cross-polishing to define the kisaki. Now, typically that was done on Japanese swords, not so typically done on Korean swords. The other thing that you can see is that it's got no fuller or bohi. That's a very Korean thing. Some of the higher up better made Korean swords did have a fuller, but most of the lower end ones didn't. Other things are that it's quite long. It's a over 70 centimeter blade length with a hamon, so that's typically found post Imjin War. And also the way that the scabbard is mounted, it's not mounted at a hip one like a tachi style. It's done like a katana style. That's a more modern rendition of Korean swordsmanship. But besides that, it looks quite traditional. Quite a nice design actually. It is quite expensive, but like I said, 5-sided swords were hard to make back then, and they're still hard to make because that quenching process doesn't get any easier with time. So it's a really interesting blade. It's something to have a look at if you want that little bit more sharpness and a little bit of that lightness compared to the normal shinogi-zukuri katanas. I personally don't have the money for it, but I think it's an interesting sword to look at. I hope you enjoyed going along this adventure with me and that you learned something new about Korean 5-sided swords, and I'll see you next time.